Welcome back to America's Fractured Politics. I want to start by being clear about the kind of optimism I'm talking about, because there are different kinds, and some of them are not just unhelpful, they're dangerous. I'm not talking about the kind of optimism that ignores risk, not the kind that says things will work out because they always have, and not the kind that treats American history like a guarantee instead of a warning. That kind of optimism asks people to look away from reality. And in a moment like this, looking away makes things worse. The situation we're in is serious. The threats to democracy and democratic norms are real. Institutions have been tested in ways they were not designed to handle. Some have held, some have bent, some have failed. There is no honest way to describe the current moment as stable or secure. But there is a kind of optimism, a harder kind, one that starts by looking directly at the problem, measuring it, understanding it, taking it seriously, and then deciding that the outcome is not predetermined. That's the kind of optimism I think is justified right now. So let's put the core claim on the table as plainly as possible. The United States is likely to outlast Donald Trump. Not because the threat is exaggerated. It isn't. Not because the system is stronger than we thought. In some ways, it's weaker. And not because history guarantees a good ending. It doesn't. The reason is simpler and more concrete. A larger number of Americans have not accepted the political model he represents, and that matters more than anything else. Trump's political approach depends on a particular psychological effect. It depends on making people feel small, isolated, and exhausted. It depends on turning public life into a constant stream of conflict and spectacle, so that people begin to disengage, not because they agree, but because they feel like nothing they do will matter. Look at the pattern. Judges are attacked. Journalists are discredited. Civil servants are portrayed as enemies. Election workers are threatened. Immigrants are dehumanized. Political opponents are framed as illegitimate. The point is not just to defeat these groups. The point is to send a message to everyone watching. Resistance comes with a cost. Over time, that kind of pressure is supposed to produce a kind of learned helplessness. People stop asking what they can do and start assuming that nothing can be done. But that shift is not complete, not even close. People are tired, that's true. People are frustrated, distracted, sometimes overwhelmed. That's also true. But being tired is not the same as being defeated. And that distinction is where the possibility of a different outcome lives. There's a related argument that's become more common, especially among people who see themselves as clear-eyed or realistic. It goes something like this. Democracy has already failed. The system is too far gone, and the only honest response is to accept that. That argument has a certain appeal. It sounds tough-minded. It sounds unsentimental. It sounds like the opposite of denial. But in practice, it often functions as a form of surrender. It treats a serious crisis as if it were a final outcome. It assumes that current trends will continue indefinitely. And it dismisses the role that human action plays in shaping political systems. Trump is not the beginning of these problems, and he's not the end of them either. He is the result of several long-running dynamics: weak accountability for corruption, a media environment that rewards outrage over accuracy, the normalization of disinformation, and a political culture that has become more comfortable with exclusion and grievance. Those forces created the conditions for his rise. They did not make his success inevitable, and they do not make his continued dominance inevitable either. What happens next is still contingent. It depends on decisions made by voters, by officials, by institutions, and by people who are not usually thought of as political actors, but are, in practice, essential to how the system works. That brings us to something that is easy to overlook, where American resilience actually comes from. It's not primarily located in the presidency. It's not located in political theater or national symbolism. It's not even located in any single institution. It comes from a distributed set of behaviors carried out by ordinary people. Election workers who show up and do their jobs even when they are being threatened. Justices who issue rulings based on law rather than pressure. Journalists who continue to report verifiable facts in an environment flooded with misinformation. Teachers who present accurate history and encourage critical thinking. Local officials who administer programs honestly and competently. voters who continue to participate even when they are told the system is broken or rigged. None of these actions on their own look decisive, but together they form the operational core of a democratic system. That core has been under stress. There's no point pretending otherwise. Norms have eroded. Some actors have pushed boundaries without facing consequences. Others have decided that winning is more important than maintaining the rules of the system. The result is visible. More open attacks on democratic processes, more tolerance for political lies, more willingness to justify behavior that would have been disqualifying in the past. There has also been reputational damage. Internationally, the United States is no longer seen as a stable model of democratic governments in the way it once was. That loss of credibility has real consequences. So the damage is real. The fear is real. The uncertainty is real. But one of the effects of this period is that it has stripped away a number of assumptions that were never entirely accurate to begin with. For a long time, there was a tendency to treat democratic stability as self-sustaining. The idea was that institutions once established would maintain themselves, that norms once accepted would continue to be followed. That extreme behavior would be contained by the system itself. That view underestimated how much democracy depends on ongoing human choices. Laws do not enforce themselves. They require officials willing to apply them. Courts do not implement their own rulings. They depend on compliance. Norms do not survive violations if those violations carry no consequences. Elections do not function without people willing to administer them fairly and accept the results. These are not abstract points. They are practical realities, and they are now much harder to ignore. That creates an uncomfortable but useful clarity. If democracy is going to hold, it will be because people decide to uphold it. Which leads to another important point. Returning to what people often call normal is not enough. The version of normal that existed before this period included a number of blind spots. There was too much tolerance for corruption as long as it was not too visible. Too much willingness to treat extreme rhetoric as entertainment. Too much confidence that institutions would correct problems without sustained public engagement. Those assumptions help create the environment in which Trump can rise. So the goal cannot simply be restoration. It has to be improvement. That means stronger safeguards, clearer accountability, and broader participation, all enacted into law. It means recognizing that democracy is not something that runs in the background. It requires active maintenance. At the same time, it's important not to overstate the level of control Trump actually has. He has significant influence. He has a committed base. He has demonstrated an ability to shape the behavior of his party and dominate media attention. But he does not have total control over the country. He does not have universal support. He does not control every institution. And he does not own the public. Authoritarian movements rely heavily on perception. Specifically, they rely on convincing people that resistance is pointless, that the outcome is already decided, and that participants symbolic at best. That perception can become self-reinforcing if people accept it, but it can also break down if people continue to act in ways that can contradict it. This is where the less visible forms of political participation become important. Voting consistently in all elections, not just presidential ones. Working or volunteering in election administration. Supporting independent journalism and credible information sources. Engaging with local government, where many decisions with direct impact are actually made. Organizing around specific issues, rather than waiting for national figures to act. Holding officials accountable through oversight, advocacy, and when necessary, legal action. None of these actions are dramatic. Most of them do not attract sustained attention. But they are how political systems are shaped over time. The United States has faced several severe internal challenges before. Periods of violence, division, institutional breakdown, and contested legitimacy. Those periods did not resolve themselves. They changed because people intervened, often over long periods and with uneven progress. There is no reason to assume this moment will be different in that respect. What is required now is a shift in how citizenship is understood. It cannot be treated as occasional, It cannot be something that activates only during major national elections. At the same time, it does not require everyone to become a full-time political actor. The more realistic model is distributed responsibility. Different people contributing in different ways, based on their capacity, skills, and circumstances. What matters is consistency. Small actions repeated across millions of people accumulate into durable forms of power. That's true for democratic systems, and it's also true for movements that seek to undermine them. Trump's approach to politics is built around control, loyalty, and dominance. It treats the country as something to be directed and, if necessary, coerced. A more sustainable alternative is based on obligation, on the idea that maintaining a democratic system requires ongoing effort and honesty about its weaknesses. That includes being clear about what has been learned during this period, that rights are not permanently secured, that institutions can fail under pressure, that disinformation can shape public perception in significant ways, that political actors will sometimes prioritize power over principle. These are not comfortable lessons, but they are useful ones because they reduce the risk of repeating the same mistakes over and over again. There are still millions of Americans who understand these dynamics and act accordingly. They understand that the presidency is not absolute, that elections are meaningful even when contested, that courts matter, but only as a part of a broader system, that civic participation is not optional if democratic norms are to be maintained. These understandings are not evenly distributed, and they are not always dominant in public discourse, but they are present and they are operational. That is why it is reasonable to think that the country can move through this period without collapsing into a fully authoritarian system. Not because collapse is impossible, because there are still enough countervailing forces to prevent it, if they continue to be used. That if matters. Survival is not automatic. It depends on whether people remain engaged, whether institutions continue to function, and whether violations of democratic norms are treated as unacceptable rather than inevitable. It also depends on whether people resist the temptation to disengage. One of the most effective political strategies available to any leader with authoritarian tendencies is to dominate attention to the point where everything becomes reactive. People wake up asking what happened overnight, what the latest statement was, what the newest conflict is. That creates a sense that politics is something that happens to them, rather than something they participate in shaping. Shifting away from that mindset is important. The more useful question is not just what is happening, but what can be done in response, and what can be built that is not dependent on any single political figure. That's how agency is maintained. An agency in this context is the key variable. No individual controls the entire system. No group controls every outcome. But people do control whether they participate, whether they uphold standards, and whether they accept or reject the normalization of anti-democratic behavior. Those choices, aggregated over time, shape the direction of the system. That is not a fast process. It is not always visible in the short term, but it is how durable political change happens. There's also a broader point about what it means to care about a country in this kind of moment. A model of patriotism that treats the country as something to be defended uncritically is not particularly useful here. A more functional model treats it as something that requires maintenance, correction, and at times repair. That includes acknowledging failures, identifying risks, and taking responsibility for improving outcomes. That kind of engagement is more demanding, but it is also more stable. It does not depend on idealized narratives. It depends on continued effort. And it is less vulnerable to manipulation because it is grounded in observable reality rather than symbolic performance. Trump's political style relies heavily on performance, on projecting strength, on creating conflict and demanding loyalty. That approach can be effective in the short term, especially in fragmented information environments. But it is less effective against a population that remains engaged, informed, and willing to act across multiple levels of the system. That is where the underlying optimism comes from. Not from belief that everything will be fine. Not from the assumption that institutions will fix themselves, but from the observation that there are still enough people in enough roles doing enough of the necessary work to keep the system functioning. That continues, and that is the critical condition. Then the current period, while damaging, does not have to be terminal. It can instead become a phase that leads to a more realistic and more resilient understanding of what democracy requires. That outcome is not guaranteed, but it is still available. And the difference between those two possibilities, decline and recovery, comes down in large part to whether the people decide to remain participants rather than becoming spectators. Keep up the fight. This has been American Fractured Politics. I'll see you next time.